Okay, now we're really ready to start with property. We've talked about life and liberty over here, and all we're going to do, at least at first, is we're going to add property. Let's give them a shovel, because that's what we did the first couple weeks. And just to exaggerate, it's got to be go-go gadget shovel into the ground, which is also going to send out ripple effects, which are good ripple effects. And we're going to call that property. Now, I have it extending outside of the image of God just for space. But the whole point is that we're going to say that this belongs to the image of God. We'll draw that out a little bit more later. But we're going to talk about the essence of property, and we're going to talk about violence against it. Same thing we did with life and liberty. Property from the Latin, the word here, the adjective, there's a couple of words. There's another word for property in Latin, but proprietas, that's adjectival form that's kind of made into a noun, the nominative case there. But you don't have to know the language to hear the sound. And proper. Oh, so what we're really saying is that property is proper to the image of God. It flows from his essential creativity, and it belongs to, in biblical terminology, it belongs to his stewardship. That stewardship of which God has entrusted him. And here again we note that slander against God's law that we have been seeing and that we are guarding against. And that is that property, just as much as life and liberty, cannot be reduced to an Enlightenment construct. And again, who says so? God says so. And I know those two words, liberty and property, are not in Genesis 9, 5, and 6, but they show up in the rest of the law as an extension to it. And so, again, God says to man, for example, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion. That's Genesis 1:28. Into your hand they are delivered, namely the lower creatures. Genesis 9:2, reaffirmation to Noah. The earth he has given to the children of man. Psalm 115:16. Now at this point, there's no way to tell, just from those, whether this is a common property or a private property. But hold that thought, we'll get to it. But right now, what we at least see, and that's part of why Adam is an individual, and there's things about marriage there as well, and child rearing. But there's a stewardship here. And going back from the Latin to the Greek, in the New Testament, that word is used a little bit, usually in a context of ministry and Paul talking about what God has entrusted to him, but that oikonomia. Now that word's important because it comes from the word for house, oikos. It's not just the yogurt. I don't know why they even went with that, but it's house. And so oikonomia is the stewardship, and just put the words together. Nomos is law. It's the law of the house. Guess what? We get the word economics from that. The law of the house. And so domus in the Latin for house, very closely associated with dominium, which is where we get the English word dominion, which is what shows up in your English translations for, Genesis 1:28 and elsewhere. And so the word economics is closely associated with this household stewardship. And remember, in the history, in the flow, it moves from the man in the home to a group of homes, and Aristotle covers this development in his Politics, and that's because it's a pagan development as well as a biblical development. But this household stewardship, which implies that the material resources belong to God, and they've been entrusted by God. And so property, every bit as much as we saw with liberty, is a worship issue. Whatever you do, all to the glory of God. Property will be a worship issue too, or it's idolatry. You don't have any middle ground or third option there. It's either worship of the true God in everything you do, or it's idolatry. But again, there's that question hanging out. Is property private? Is it public? Is it both? Is it neither? Well, what follows this notion of stewardship is that we could speak of property the same way we did about life and liberty in other respects too. It is inalienable. Remember that word. Inalienable. And that cannot be given and taken away is with respect to the system of man to man. Okay, so while we can all affirm that all property is ultimately God's, not ultimately ours, yet in this system of man's relationship to man, that's what's meant by inalienable. So don't be a cute Calvinist who's attracted to collectivism, which is no Calvinist at all, who says, but we don't have any rights. God is sovereign. He doesn't owe us anything. Okay, you're talking about vertically or outside of this circle. We're talking about in the system, second table of the law, man to man. Okay? So in the system, man's relation to man, property is private. Okay? So it's not public anywhere. But you can say, well, it all belongs to God. Psalm 24:1. Yes, outside the circle, inside the second table of the law, we are saying, and we will show, that it is private. That is to say, individual. Private doesn't mean not good for others. No, it just means individual. Okay? And so in the system, it's private. And this is proven, first of all, by the 8th and the 10th commandments. Think about it. Theft is a form of force or fraud, but most obviously force. Hear the 8th commandment. You shall not steal. That's Exodus 20:15. This is reaffirmed in the particular laws of Israel in Exodus 21:28 through 36. Chapter 22, verse 1 through 15. Deuteronomy 21:1 through 4, and 23:24 through 25. This was reinforced by the concept, the sanctity of property boundaries, those ancient landmark texts. For example, you shall not move your neighbor's landmark, which the men of old have set, in the inheritance that you will hold in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. See the outer and the inner circle? The Lord is giving you. And so set up stones for this particular man's lot. Okay? And that's Deuteronomy 19:14. You see it again affirmed in Proverbs 22:28 and 23:10. So that's property. And that's theft. But there's things that lead to envy. I said both the 8th and the 10th commandment will affirm this. Envy. Envy is the handmaiden of theft. Hear the 10th commandment, reinforcing the 8th. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. By the way, not everything there is your neighbor's by natural law as property. You notice wife, servants? I'm not unaware of the objections there, but there are things there that now are regarding coveting and not theft. And so the sense, in other words, the object of the image of God that's violated in the 10th is very related to, but not identical to, the object that's violated in the 8th. In the 8th, it is his property. In the 10th, it is his whole lot. Some of that is natural law, his property. Everything else in there is still proper to him within the concept of positive law. We haven't even gotten there yet. We're going there next week and the week after. We'll talk about the forms of law, and hopefully you'll just hold that thought and be patient with me on that, because I can't defend it right now. But you can at least see that the 10th commandment reinforces the 8th and says, in effect, don't even think about it. What Augustine would have called that inordinate desire. In other words, to lust after. And concupiscence was not simply about that which we call lust, but it is desiring any good outside of God, because there's no such thing. And any political philosophy that is motivated by that. You can't separate that from these commandments. These commandments in the second table are man to man. Any political philosophy that is motivated by economic leveling, under that false notion that we've already discussed of equality of outcomes, is already ruled out by God's law in the 8th and 10th commandments. Indeed, Paul tells us in Colossians 3:5 that covetousness is idolatry. Covetousness is not simply a political philosophy that is ruled out by God's word. It is a different religion worshiping a false god. It is idolatry, Colossians 3:5. Now, this right flows from metaphysical to physical properties, from creativity to the ground. That's why I drew the shovel. It's not because this is a particular job that I have in mind. It's just to symbolize Adam in Genesis 2:15 working and keeping it. Rutherford roots this in creation or natural law. He says, all the goods of the subjects belongeth not to the king. I presuppose that the divisions of goods doth not necessarily flow away from the law of nature. In other words, all men never forfeit that natural right, is what he's saying there. Okay, that doesn't go away. He says, for God made man before the fall Lord of the creatures indefinitely. You want an indefinitely? Psalm 8, well after the fall, in sin. Man's still in dominion. So there's an indefinitely for you. But he roots it in natural law, the property of every single person. It belongs to the person that exists first. Before any king, before any form of civil government, property inheres in the man. Which man? Every man. What is proper to the image. Words like goods, as we'll see in economics, suggest this. Now remember our doctrine of creation. I talked about those ABCs in session 1. So, this is so simple. But I said, watch how quickly we go back on it. Our doctrine of creation, that God made both physical resources and that creativity and dominion of man good. Not just the stuff, but his motion upon the stuff is inherently good. But man does X, Y, and Z with it. So there you go. I told you would violate it. You can't call the line crooked unless you have the idea of the perfect line. Unless you know what the stewardship of the resources ought to look like, which is to say that there is a good. Moreover, we saw that this cultivation of the resources glorified God. Both the image in his body and soul, his reason, his creativity, and the image in his movement of resources is an image. That motion between man and man will say something about God. And one reason is that one does not move these resources without care of those under. Now, some of this I'm not going to be able to prove till we get to economics, and we talk about not only voluntary exchange, but the profit motive. That one of those things at the top of your list of things that you might think, well, that's surely dirty. The man does not move without a care of those under him. And he doesn't care for those under him by dying and not having a profit motive. As we will see, he has a care for others precisely in how he moves to the ground for gain. We'll see that. But that sphere of voluntary exchange with other proper movers of the ground, all of this produces what we rightly call goods. We don't call them bads. I don't. If you call them bads, that's your problem. But they're goods and services, not bads and services. No, but I know bads and services that are sold out of the back of a truck or whatever else. That's your problem. You can't call that line crooked unless you have the idea of a straight line. It's precisely in property, being individual, that it is good for society. Another Reformed author of the late 16th century going into the 17th century, Johannes Althusius, his Politica, another book I'll refer to from time to time, puts it in this way. He says, quote, "For the same reason, God distributed his gifts unevenly among men. He did not give all things to one person, but some to one and some to others, so that you have need of my gifts and I for yours." Oh, because we're going to make to each his own and from each blah, blah, blah. No. God did that division of labor from the beginning, inhering in the individual as an individual. And so Althusius continues, so was born, as it were, the need for communicating necessary and useful things, which communication was not possible except in social and political life. God therefore willed that each need the service and aid of others, in order that friendship would bind all together, and no one would consider another to be valueless. Now, if this is true, what he's saying, it's natural. It doesn't need to be coerced. In fact, if you tried to coerce it, you'd have something other than this. This is the nature of things. And this right, just like life and liberty, is also transferred in the sense of delegated, not in the sense of removed or forfeited, as Thomas Hobbes will argue, and we'll look at his argument in a few weeks. But Rutherford says about this movement to the collective force, and to preserve a community from violence of rapine and theft, a magistrate and king was devised. Now that part of it Hobbes would agree with. The difference is that Rutherford would say each man retains this right. He's not giving his property to the state, and then when things don't work out, he takes back what is not his. No. It inheres in him and continues to do so. Now, there's a lot of stuff I have in here about the right and the good of documentation of property and why that's so necessary for a free market, but we can come to that another time. The natural good of labor. So I talked about property, talked about theft, talked about envy, all these different things. The natural good of labor and the evil of sloth. Like property, labor was also before the fall. That's crucial to understand. It's there in Genesis 2. The thorns and thistles don't show up to Genesis 3, but the thorns and thistles are not profit motive and hard work. That's not what's there. I said the word hard, but I'm using that in this. Think of intense and passion and gain. That's not part of the fall. Adam was placed in the garden to work it and keep it, and the ground would bear thorns and thistles for him after the curse in Genesis 3:20. But that's no more problematic than the fact that their dominion now encompasses just force. Yes, now good work is now covered in thorns and thistles. So you gotta brush that away to get to the core to see what's still good. And we've seen what life and liberty say about God, and conversely how murder and slavery, its opposites, lie about God. So what about property? How does property glorify God? Well, Wayne Grudem, in his book on politics, gives this analysis, and I think it's a good summary. He says, quote, "Just as God is sovereign over the whole universe, so he gives us opportunity to be sovereign over a small portion of land, or a car, or clothing and books." You can see he's an intellectual. I go with books too. And so forth. In our stewardship of these possessions, we have opportunities to imitate God's wisdom, his creativity, his love for other people, his justice and fairness, his mercy, his knowledge, and many other attributes. You see that? Divine attributes clearly seen through that motion and care of property. And there's a cause and effect relationship to working with one's property. Proverbs 10:4 says, "A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich." You walk through those Proverbs and you think to yourself, man, I don't even know what to do with that. That's so simple. Well, then why don't you do it? I always say that to people about the Proverbs. It's filled with things that are ABCs, which you don't do. And neither do I. Okay? And so I feel like a lot of this life, liberty, and property stuff, we just got in our mail today. We're going to look at this Frederick Bastiat book in the second session, but the kids' version, the Tuttle twins, we just got that. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, you know what? That's no different than Bastiat. It's no different than what I did the past couple sessions. We should name this How to Be a Human Being 101. It's like the stuff you tell your toddlers. That's his. Don't step on it. Don't stick your finger in their head. Stuff like that. That's literally what we need to tell people right now about politics. So, a slack hand causes poverty, and the hand of the diligent makes rich. Now, the opposite of hard work is sloth. And no one can honestly read the Proverbs without concluding that God does not spare laziness from the evils of his condemnation. Hear the Apostle Paul as well in the New Testament to the Thessalonians. even when we were with you, we would give you this command. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busy bodies. Now such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and to earn their own living. So Paul reaffirms here and elsewhere the value of working with your hands in the pastoral letters. And not just that, there's a link between being idle and being a troublemaker. And that's not just in the church. That's in society as well. There is a link between being up to no good and being up to no good. There's a link. And Paul draws that out. And so he says, 1 Thessalonians 5:14, admonish the idle. They're doing something wrong. Pastors admonish the idle. You've all heard the saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop. Well, that they are. And so we need to understand this, that when there's an attack on this, I'll bet the guy isn't working. And that's what the Bible is very, very, very consistent on. I had some material here on, why does Jefferson use pursuit of happiness instead of property, and matching that up to Locke. And Locke talks about the pursuit of happiness in the same, and that's very interesting, but we'll do that another time because we have a lot of material. What's the essence of the proper division of goods? I kind of suggested in Althusius's comment something of a precursor to Adam Smith and that division of labor. What's the essence of that? Where does that come from, the division of goods? Well, there's other stories. There's other narratives other than the Christian view of the proper... In fact, open up an economics textbook. I was going to wait for this, but open up a basic college economics textbook, and on page 1, your definition of economics is something like the allocation, or us, how does it say it? Use that as a verb. Allocating scarce resources, and I always stop like the record needle coming off. Give me that again, teacher. Allocating, stop. When you say that as a verb, as your definition of economics, you are starting out with a Marxist definition of economics. Who's we? And what do you ing? Economics is first and foremost a study of an object, an economy. Scarce resources, yes, but a body of resources and a body of real relations and laws and how it works with the profit motive and price system and all those good things. When you ing that right away, you're telling me that you and your smart friends are going to be allocating some resources and that we're just reading this book to properly bow down to your understanding of how that gets together. Well, where does this come from? It comes from different narratives of how things should be allocated. Who are they complaining against? It ain't Moses. It's God. 4 alternative sub-narratives, and oftentimes these go together, and they usually just do go together. Number 1, that competition begets inequalities, which is bad. Rousseau was big on that, his discourse on the origin of inequalities. Second sub-narrative, property is theft, and that by a mercantilist logic. Mercantilism is going to have this zero-sum game, just like socialism would. Mercantilism did first. Capitalism did X, Y, and Z in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th. No, it doesn't. You obviously don't know the difference between capitalism, which is metaphysical and produces that which is not yet. Supply creates its own demand, as opposed to mercantilism, which has in its view that there's a fixed amount of resources, and the only way I can get that gold from Africa is by colonizing them and bringing them over. That's what caused slavery, not capitalism. You don't know the difference between them. And the zero-sum fallacy, the zero-sum premise behind that, mercantilism shares with socialism. We'll come back to that and we'll show that in great detail later on. But property is theft. The third sub-narrative is basically a Marxist view of the same thing. Profit is theft. Why? By a labor theory of value. And I won't bore you with that yet. We'll get to that when we get to economics. But a labor theory of value is, again, it's a zero sum, except in the workshop. And so whatever went into building this thing is what it is. And if I pick anything off the top, I'm stealing it. And so property comes from robbing other people. Fourthly and finally, industrialization is theft by a social evolution. This is also Marx and Marxism. That the Industrial Revolution transplanted society and even families. That's that one point in the Communist Manifesto when Marx softened up his voice and said, "For the children." You know, the families that in an agrarian society could be families for centuries, but now through this urbanization, to meet the demand, it creates a mass propertyless, that's a hard one to say 10 times, class that offers more and more and more of yourselves and has less and less kids, which didn't happen, but as far as splitting up the family, like they cared about that, read Engels' writings on that, to a monopoly of urban capitalists. Okay, but in all four of those, and they go together, you have a zero-sum game, and you can't imagine this happening unless Adam stole it from whoever was there first, and so forth. Well, let's do a little instant replay. And put two guys in the ring here, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And we're going to do an instant replay, two different stories of how this first happened. The first private property. First, let's turn to Locke. Here's Locke's story. Quote, "The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his." Well, that's what we say. "Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from that common state nature placed it in, well, at least he's violating the earth." Okay, sorry, I had a radical environmentalist on my shoulder. But, so he won't have other problems, but he'll run into that guy. Locke continues, "It hath by his labor something annexed to it that excludes the common right of other men." So clearly Locke is for private property, and he's saying that doing that actually doesn't take here and give only there, and that's the whole story, but it actually multiplied. Something in the reason of man didn't just colonize this dirt and move it over here, but made something that was not there before. We'll come back to that idea. Let's go to Rousseau. Rousseau's story. He's going to rewind the clock and give us his instant replay angle. And he divides inequalities between natural and what he calls moral or political or conventional inequalities. And he paints this against the backdrop of the infamous, I'm sure you've heard of this, his noble savage. Before that, everything was cool in nature. Okay, so he says, "The first man, who after enclosing a piece of ground, took into his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. How many crimes," Rousseau says, "how many wars, how many murders, how many misfortunes and horrors would that man have saved the human species who, pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditches, should have cried to his fellow, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong equally to all of us, and the earth itself to nobody.'" Sounds like a summer of love that Rousseau was peddling there. But just so you know, that's the battle here. Karl Marx put it plainly in the Communist Manifesto, quote, "The theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property." Now, of course, there's more to it than that. But Marx said you can sum it up in a single sentence, and that's the one he thought of. Abolition of private property. Now, from a theological perspective, John Murray, in his Principles of Conduct, Reformed theologian, 20th century, he speaks about inequality in theological terms. He says, quote, "Equality is not a fact of God's providence. Unequal distribution of wealth is indigenous to the order God has established and to the natures with which he has endowed us." Again, we talked about that last time. That's obvious if what you mean is all the nature stuff, the material stuff. Let me use the word material there so I don't confuse terms. Because if you are a naturalist or a materialist in that sense, what other ground do you have for equality? Everything else about us is unequal. And so if you're going to talk about a law of nature that's equal, you must inevitably mean something metaphysical. Okay, let's read the catechisms on this. What does the Westminster Shorter Catechism say about the Eighth Commandment's do's and don'ts, the duties and prohibitions? Well, I said shorter. I meant larger. Westminster Larger Catechism 141. What's positively required in that Eighth Commandment? Here's the answer. The duties required in the Eighth Commandment are truth, faithfulness, and justice in contracts and commerce between man and man, rendering to everyone his due, restitution of goods unlawfully detained from the right owners thereof, giving and lending freely, according to our abilities, and the necessities of others, moderation of our judgments, wills, and affections concerning worldly goods, a provident care and study to get, keep, use, and dispose of those things which are necessary and convenient for the sustentation of our nature, and suitable to our condition. A lawful calling and diligence, a lawful calling and diligence in the frugality, avoiding unnecessary lawsuits and suretyship, or other like engagements, and an endeavor by all just and lawful means to procure, preserve, and further the wealth and outward estate of others as well as our own. By the way, the shorter really just takes that last part. I read the longer partly to leave myself open and vulnerable here to something that I noticed, and you may have noticed it too. This restitution of goods unlawfully detained from the rightful owners thereof. One of the big controversies now is reparations for slavery. And so the question, how do you interpret that? Does the Westminster Larger Catechism demand reparations? Yes, to its rightful owner by the person that broke the law. So if you didn't catch that answer, we can talk about that when we get to those weeks. But I'm aware of that, and it's a good question. But we have to have clear definitions of that. Secondly, what is negatively forbidden in the Westminster Larger Catechism, question 142? The sins forbidden in the Eighth Commandment, besides the neglect and the duties required, are theft, robbery, man-stealing, and receiving anything that is stolen, fraudulent dealing, false weights and measures, removing landmarks, injustice and unfaithfulness in contracts between man and man, or in matters of trust, oppression, extortion, usury, bribery, vexatious lawsuits, unjust enclosures, and depopulations. So there's a lot of things that America's done. And other things that we do today that we have conscience issues about. Receiving government funds, is that, so those things, it's understandable that people have conscience issues there. Engrossing commodities to enhance the price, inflation, unlawful callings and all other unjust or sinful ways of taking or withholding from our neighbor what belongs to him, or of enriching ourselves, covetousness, inordinate prizing and affecting worldly goods, distrustful and distracting cares and studies in getting, keeping, and using them, envying at the prosperity of others, as likewise idleness, prodigality, wasteful gaming, and other ways whereby we do unduly prejudice our own outward estate, and defrauding ourselves of the due use and comfort of that estate which God has given. I say all that because there's a lot. And they were very thoughtful in the medieval and the Reformed tradition about these things. And they were social and economic things. Fast forward. Taxes. We will wait till economics to deal with that. I had some Old Testament texts on which are interesting, but which we don't have time for. So I will wait for that. Because if I did that, the whole taxation is theft thing, and dealt with that, there's other things in those larger catechism questions and answers that, why don't you deal with that? So I'll wait for that till the weeks that we get to economics, and I stress weeks. It'll be plural weeks on that. So I will stop there, and when we come back, we will deal with a very fun, moving from this, natural rights to civil rights. We'll come back.